Our next presenter, Andrew Duvall, will address some of the key issues around commuting and mobility in rural communities, as well as strategies to improve geographic equity. He is a transportation behavior analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and serves as a project lead for research in the U.S. Department of Energy's smart mobility efforts. We're thrilled to have him. Welcome, Andrew.
Great, thanks. Glad to be here. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and I'm not certain about my camera, but I'll just keep moving forward.
We'll leave it on as long as we can and turn it off if we need to.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, as I was introduced, I'd like to give myself just a little bit more background. I work in behavioral science and in the transportation group at NREL, and we've started to identify a number of different new challenges associated with rural mobility. And this is kind of personal for me in a way, because I grew up in rural Wyoming on a ranch. I'm a graduate of the University of Wyoming and the University of Colorado, and most of my relatives and family live in rural areas. And thinking about what the future of transportation might look like from my the people in my background, I think it is something that kind of drives me. So so some of the challenges associated with rural transportation, thinking about overall the number of people that it affects, even though within the past decade we've transitioned to a majority of people living in urban areas, just over 50%, that still means that about half the population still live in rural or exurban or small town situations. And that's over a fairly vast area. About 97% of the US landmass has less than 20% of the population. Looking at the link between mobility and employment in rural settings, it's very strong. Without a car, most people can't have a job. It's access to employment, access to commerce and other destinations really require, at least in the current situation, having a private car to get there. This is contributing to a shift that's been occurring over the past several decades of younger generations moving elsewhere to find employment, to find other opportunities. And so that's contributed to that shift toward urban areas. And it's become an economic drain on these rural and small town places. Tech adoption within rural settings also can lag behind those in urban areas, especially emerging drivetrain options associated with electric vehicles. The distances are greater, there are fewer charging or EVSE resources, and just access to everything is typically quite a bit longer than in an urban setting. One critical item that I'll touch on in a later slide is that the mobility crisis is emerging with the boomers generation aging out of driving, and that affects rural areas a bit more than in urban areas. Next slide. So looking at just a few of the factors associated between the rural context and the urban context in the recent development of both technology and innovations with mobility, it has not been even across the board. Mobility as a service options are, for the most part, not really available or viable in a rural context. Vehicle electrification, as I mentioned before, also poses a lot of challenges. The infrastructure is not really there, and the incentives to build it out are fairly limited with a fairly low population density. On-demand economy is a place where that has had a fairly significant effect in rural areas. Access to more goods through online sources and delivery that opens the door for a lot more commerce in rural areas as compared to the previous paradigm. Infrastructure, as with most places in the US, the automobile is still the king, but transit doesn't really exist in many rural and small towns. Bikes, from a cultural standpoint, physical mobility is really not seen as being an alternative. And along with that, infrastructure challenges associated with communication, fast internet is also lagging. So thinking about re-envisioning small communities, trying to mitigate that population loss, there are some emerging trends that seem to be appearing where remote workers are being encouraged to relocate to small communities. This is beneficial in a number of different ways for the community, even though the job might not have a direct income associated with taxing an employer. These types of situations can support all the industries that support services and goods associated with more people moving into an area. Remote working is becoming a lot more familiar to a lot of people. You're probably experiencing remote working now. And this situation may allow us to re-envision what a bedroom community means. This is just an example. Tulsa, Oklahoma recently announced that they are paying $10,000 as an incentive for remote workers to move there. They're saying, you know, that's a great place to live. There are educational opportunities for people with young children. And the cost of living is less expensive, and access to things are approaching on par with a larger city. But from an employee standpoint, real estate and a lot of other things are less expensive. Just acknowledging some of the differences between rural areas helps us frame from a research standpoint. It's not just a city that's spread out, but there are very real and different needs and characteristics associated with mobility. There is also a prevailing attitude that's somewhat culturally different in rural areas. And I think embracing that identification of self-reliance and independence can be a way to help explore and encourage adoption of emerging trends and practices in mobility. Just as an example, the first automated vehicle I ever rode on was a John Deere field tractor. And my uncle, my wife's uncle, who owns a large farm in North Dakota, was very excited about showing how he was saving money by more accurately seeding and spraying his crops. And so I think that there's a pragmatism associated with the adoption of these new technologies. On the right, there's a Rivian work truck that actually offers a lot of benefits over that of an internal combustion engine equivalent, say a Ford F-150, that for people who are in rural settings that are dependent on their vehicles as a work platform or as their office, opportunities to reimagine what that might look like. Last point I really want to touch on is that aging demographic in rural settings. There's a larger differential of population that are 65 or older in rural areas, and that's expected only to increase over the next decade or so. And as those older population age, their ability to drive themselves every place they need to go, as they've been accustomed to throughout their lives, is probably not going to be likely. So thinking about an automated vehicle future, or reimagining what transit might look like in a rural setting. Those are really kind of crucial pieces to enabling these people to age at home, to reduce the load on assisted living that in many rural places is also very limited. This also offers opportunities for medicine to be conducted remotely. That's starting to emerge in public health settings as remote medicine. And actually the COVID-19 virus has started to augment these sort of remote approaches. So just to wrap up, a couple of elements to think about in context. Just what we can learn from rural areas is that really a viability long-term for a community, it can't be dependent entirely on one mode. What we're working with in an urbanist setting, the ability to transition between modes or use the most appropriate mode, I think strengthens a community and provides alternatives. There are unintended consequences that might be associated with some of the emerging technologies. I point to a possible gentrification of rural and non-metro areas where people might move in, see the land as being inexpensive and kind of by price forcing out the people who are living in those communities at present. And an inordinate effect, especially on underprivileged and lower income communities that might experience increase in real estate prices, being forced to completely reimagine how they have to conduct their lives. So that's primarily the end. Hopefully there's a time for a question or two, but I'm always happy to engage offline.
Thank you, Andrew. And we are, I'm going to turn my video feed on too, hoping for things will keep going well. Your presentation came through great. We do have at least one question, and if other folks have questions, please hit up that question pane. It's really great to hear about how all of this impacts rural communities. I also grew up in a fairly rural area, and you know, transit and van pooling and things like that just weren't part of anything that the folks in the community that I grew up with were aware of. And it's neat to see ways that the industry is starting to imagine what TDM, what transportation options look like in a rural community. One of the questions we had came in from Mark, asking, with the trend toward telecommuting, have you seen any instances of companies setting up in more rural areas because their work doesn't require employees to be on site? So this is kind of the flip side. Instead of thinking about remote work employees choosing more rural areas, have you seen any indication that there might be companies doing the same thing?
Yes, I'm aware of a couple of instances where server farms are located in rural areas, in part because electricity is fairly cheap, and at a higher elevation, it's easier to cool facilities. And so for certain maybe specialized industries, it might make sense to identify places that have a rural setting, probably some employment base, but not necessarily the need for a huge number of employees. Other opportunities, I think, are distribution centers where there are maybe a crossroads of major interstates where trucks or other delivery vehicles can transition their loads between different directions.
Great examples. Another question we've got from Matthew Wald. Do you know, or could you share about any funding or subsidy programs for rural programs that are trying to galvanize this kind of transportation change?
Sure. Well, the Department of Energy last year had a funding opportunity that funded 5 initial rural applied research grants. Those are just starting to get underway. I'm leading the coordination between the DOE and the National Lab System and these grantees. But it's likely that this will be an extended research funding system. I think that overall, transportation research is just now starting to acknowledge that there are shortages and understanding the potential impacts in rural mobility research. And so I anticipate that there are a lot more opportunities in the not so distant future. Get in contact with me and I can help coordinate if there's any interest.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being a part of this. It's great to have this as part of the CommuteCon program this year, and we will be sharing that slide deck and your contact information if folks want to talk about this after the fact. So thanks again for joining us, and keep doing the good work.
Terrific. I appreciate it. Thanks.